This will be an actual Dharma talk. We haven't done one of those in a while. But it seemed like we need to do it, so I'll do it. So one of you emailed me this email, but it could have been, a lot of people have been feeling this and talking about this with me, so it could have been anybody. Could have been all of you. Johann, so you said love is the fabric of the universe, but I don't see it. Reading the news last night, it was all murder, corruption, war, violence, lies, etc. Where is that love? Where is the Buddha nature? Are we just telling stories to ourselves to make ourselves feel better? Well, even if we are, that's not a bad thing. It's better than a lot of things you could do. I almost felt guilty sitting on my comfy cushion last night and sending love to myself while a 7-year-old was raped and killed in Mexico. A crazy gunman shot 10 people in Germany. Trump pardoned corrupt criminals, and Syria was bombed again. So that's, I think, a reasonable question. So let's start with the most fundamental piece of this, which is what's real? What's reality anyway? Is there, in fact, a world that is a world with a capital W, that exists independently of us and is objectively has certain objective characteristics? Because if there is such a world, then you could begin to ascribe, well, is it or isn't this way or that way? That would be a meaningful question. Like, is the world made of love, or is it made of hate and war and rape and etc.? But if you carefully observe your own experience, just as you find that there is no solid self that has certain characteristics, a thing, you find that there is no such thing as a world that has solidity and objective permanence to it with certain characteristics that you can say this is the way the world is. So that's a pretty dramatic statement. But take something simple. Okay, let's just take something simple. Most of you are probably aware that there was a Super Bowl, right? Anybody watch it? Okay, not that many. Probably more people in most average groups, but less in this group. But anyway, there was a Super Bowl. But was there one Super Bowl? How many Super Bowls were there, really? I watched the Super Bowl, okay? Now, I think my experience of watching it was really different than the players playing it. It was certainly different than the coaches. And I watched it on TV, so it was certainly different than the people in the stands. It was certainly different than the parents of the players or the children of the players. It was certainly different from the people rooting for the team that I wasn't rooting for, because they lost. Nah. In fact, I would venture to say it was completely different than Charlie's experience. You watched it, right?
Also on TV.
Yeah, on TV, but your experience of it, if we, what we remember of it is probably very different.
I was also happy with the outcome.
Okay. So there's a few points of confluence, but the more you drill into the experience of where you were and who you were with, and, did you watch the commercials or didn't you? did you watch it on a DVR so you could avoid the commercials, or were the commercials the highlight for you? The more you drill into this, there wasn't a Super Bowl. There were millions of Super Bowls. There were millions. And then it wasn't just a Super Bowl, right? It was hours. Like, it went on for hours. And people talked about it for weeks beforehand and weeks afterhand and blah, 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 blah. Like, there is no such thing as the Super Bowl. It's a word that we can use to refer to something. But the thing we're referring to is not a thing. It's millions of different experiences. And that experience keeps changing. Like, I had one experience when I watched it, one experience when I talked about it the next day, and now it's, a month and a half later or whatever. No, it's not even that long. No. See, I can't even, relate to how long ago it was. It's a few weeks later, right? So, most of it's, out of my memory. I don't remember every play. I watched every play, but a football coach would probably have watched every play 10 times and remembered them all. So this experience, even for me, keeps changing. So, is there really a world that we could talk about as a world, or is there just a set of experiences that are coming through our senses and then being conditioned by all of our past experience and who we are, and then being processed in terms of memory and concepts and judgments and values, and then we create that world. And if we're in a certain kind of mood, the world feels one way. If we're in a certain kind of mood, the world feels another. So whoever wrote this email, they were in a certain kind of mood, and that was the world that they were experiencing. But the very next day, maybe they got together with a good friend or had a really warm, sweet, loving experience, and the world was a different place. That's how we live. So, the world doesn't have any characteristics at all. It has every characteristic, and they're constantly changing and moving and flowing and bouncing off of each other. This is, I'm not trying to say something that's esoteric. I'm trying to say something that actually matches with my experience of being alive. The world is just a convention. We can agree that there's a world, but then we will argue forever about what it's like, right? Nobody's going to agree with what I say the world is like. And I'm not even going to agree with it, because tomorrow I'll have a different tune. One day it's a horror show, and the next day it's paradise. And it's usually both. So when we sit there and we watch the news, the news is like 1/trillionth of what's actually going on. It's linear, right? It's just what's happened, what they're putting down the pipeline then, where you're reading or listening to. That's not the world. There's at least, 7-point-something billion worlds going on Earth. And that's just the human ones. There's whale worlds, and there's worm worlds, and there's, the world for a hawk is a really different world. The world for a rabbit's a really different world. But they have their world. It's not any less or more valid than my world. So we're talking trillions of worlds, and that's just on Earth. This isn't complicated, is it? Now, conceptually it's not complicated, but to actually see yourself creating the world, catch yourself in the act of creating the world, to realize that This world is a construct that we're constantly constructing over and over, in the same way that part of the practice is to catch ourselves in the act of creating selfing. That I am no more solid or definable than the world. My sense of self is basically an illusion, it's memory. Am I really the same as I was yesterday? I mean, what's the same? What does that mean? I know some of my neurons are new and some of my cells are new. But I'm creating that sense of self, that sense of continuity. It has, as you know, if you look in the book, he talks about why is a sense of self useful from an evolutionary perspective, right? From an evolutionary psychology perspective, why even have a sense of self? Well, he talks about that in the book. So it's just a construct. It's just something we create because it's useful. Doesn't make it real. Doesn't mean something's useful. Doesn't make it real. It's certainly useful to have a sense of self, and it's a useful thing to have a sense of a world. And it'd be really cool if we all agreed on what the world was. That would make life so easy, wouldn't it? But we don't agree on it at all.
So are you saying Trump is just as right as I am?
From his perspective. So one of the things that practice is hopefully helping us do is starting to see that we're able to see. Not all the time. Sometimes we're going to be completely identified with our world or ourself. But at times of moments of clarity where you can see and watch your mind create the world. See that it's arbitrary. It's not even that you have to stop doing it. The instruction isn't to stop doing that. You can't stop doing that. All you can do is see that you're doing it. And if you see that you're doing it enough over and over, just like if you see you're creating a sense of self enough over and over, then you can start to disidentify with it. So the process may continue, but you don't believe it as much. It's not that we're creating a world in our mind or a self in the mind that's the problem. It's that we identify with it. We believe that it's true. Most of us can tell the difference between like voices in our head and voices in the world, right? That's a part of sanity. What we call sanity. Like hear out is different than hear in. It may trigger the same neurons in the mind, but we can tell the difference. That's important, right? If I'm talking to you now, it's really important that you know that the voice is coming from outside of you and it's coming from me. But if you start hearing voices in your head and it sounds like God and you have to obey them, right? And then you start doing weird shit because God's telling you to do weird shit, that's crazy. We kind of have an agreement about that. Especially if it's violent, destructive stuff. So, it's the same thing. It's okay that we're creating this sense of a world in our mind. But it would be a greater degree of sanity if we could actually realize that it's not the real world. It's just the world that we happen to be creating in this moment. It's 1/1,000,000th of the real world. There's no way that we could ever know what the real world is up to because it's too much information. And it's constantly changing. We don't know what Donald Trump is. That's a concept. I don't think any of us have ever met him. All we have is information that's filtered through other people in media, and then our own projections, our own thoughts about that. I'm not saying that would make him any better. But it's certainly not reality. It's certainly not truth. It's a construct in our minds. So that's any discussion of, what's going on in the world and how do we deal with it. The first step is we have to realize that we have no idea what's going on in the world. All we have is our ideas of the world that we're constructing in our minds at any given moment. Doesn't mean that there isn't stuff to do. Okay? This isn't saying that it's all meaningless and there's nothing to do or any of that. It's just saying that the thing that we attribute as solid or the world, there is no such thing. And taking my word for it or having that as a philosophical idea is sort of meaningless. Seeing it as a in the moment reality can be transformative. It's about being able to see it in our own experience over and over and over and over again. Like being stopped, like, oh, wow. There I am being seduced by my view of the world, whether it's pleasant or unpleasant or whatever, and constantly changing. One minute I'm being seduced by this world, and the next minute I'm being seduced by this world. Or maybe seduced isn't the right word, hypnotized, deluded. It's probably more the word than seduced. Okay, so that's step one. Now, within that, there's an amazing amount of dukkha going on. So, that's not challengeable. That's the first noble truth. I mean, that's the entire foundation, the first noble truth. The Buddha didn't say dukkha's an illusion, don't worry about it. He said there is dukkha. Period. So the world, we could argue about whether the world blah blah, but there is dukkha. That's not an illusion. We all have it personally, and we see it around us, and we see it magnified by collective forces, global institutionalized greed, global institutionalized hatred or ill will, global institutionalized delusion. So we see not just personal dukkha, but planetary dukkha, societal dukkha. So that the point of seeing how we're creating the world isn't then to say, oh, well, dukkha is just an illusion, so I don't care about it. It's not important, and my feelings that are brought up by confronting dukkha are just something that I should be learning to meditate myself out of having those feelings. That's not at all the point. So we're left in this place where the first thing that we need to do, and this is the part that nobody wants to do, this is why we want to get in our heads and philosophize and strategize and deal with everything, is, okay, there it is. Are we able to just feel it? Are we able to just be with it? Because what we want to do is we want to solve it because we don't want to feel it. So there's dukkha, there's suffering, there's injustice, there's all this stuff, and it hurts. It makes us angry or afraid or in pain, right? And then we want it to go away. And the want it to go away is actually, a clinging aversion, right? It's clinging to it not being there. It's aversion. Okay? So our response to make it go away isn't this generous, compassionate, wise motivation to action. It's, I don't want to have to feel that. So we're having an argument with reality, because the reality is we're feeling it, or it's causing that feeling to arise. And at the same time, we don't want to have to feel it. So the first step in this process is building our capacity and our willingness to just feel the way what is feels like. And that's the first step with our own personal dukkha, right? Like, there's no way out of our own personal emotional dukkha without feeling it first. You can't get rid of it. You can't change it. You can't work it out. You can't grow past it. Whatever you want to do, you can't do any of that unless you're willing to be in the thick of it first. In the thick of it without resistance. Actually loving it. Shinzen's expression is you love it to death. You love your own emotional distress to death. It's one way of phrasing it, but it's basically, and a big part of love is paying attention, right? Like, one of the most dramatic things we can do for anybody that we love is just be with them. Like, really be with them, pay attention, listen. Not like figure them out and solve them and give them advice, or just being with them, just listening to people, just hanging with them, fully present. It's a very powerful act of love. Well, that goes with our own stuff for ourselves, and it goes for the pain of the world. So the first step towards dealing with the pain in the world is actually being with it, feeling it, allowing it to be there without an argument. Because our initial argument isn't about solving the world's problem, it's about solving our problem, that we don't want to have to deal with the world's problem because it hurts too much. Right? Does that make sense? And you have to really look at your own motivation. We have to look at our own motivation here and really see the truth of that. It's not altruistic. That initial motivation is not altruistic. It's like, I don't want to have to deal with this. It makes me feel sad, angry, afraid, blah, blah, blah. And I don't want to have to feel those things because they're difficult feelings. So I'm going to put it out there and be angry at whoever I'm blaming in this moment for whatever the situation is that I'm being triggered by. So this is a very tough assignment to actually deal with, the pain of the world or the suffering of the world, let alone our own. But the process is exactly the same. The first step is we have to be willing and able to just have the capacity just to be with it. And that hurts. That is uncomfortable. It's purgatory. Purgatory ain't in the next life. This is. This life, if we're paying attention, it has an aspect of purgatory. It really does. But if we are able or willing, or through our practice, through Sangha, through the support of other people trying to do the same thing, able to just be with it and be with our own emotional reaction to that or response to that, and at the same time not get identified with the world that's creating it, and just let it be what it is. That this is just what is. It's not necessarily anybody's fault. We could say it's somebody's fault. We could, project it out. It's, it's the billionaire class, or it's this people, or it's, the dictator here and the crazy people there. But not as an excuse, but this is just human evolution. This is just what is. This is where we're at on planet Earth. A few 100,000 years ago, we were like, animals that had a few hundred words. And then things got more and more complicated, and things got way complicated really fast with technology and science over, just a few hundred years ago. Things got really complicated, and all of a sudden there wasn't just a few 100 million people running around the planet. There were billions. Way a lot of people with huge amounts of technology and absolutely no more wisdom than we had thousands of years ago when things were super simple. Right? We don't have any increased wisdom over the Buddha. I don't think it's like, the Buddha was like one very wise person who lived a few thousand years ago, and now everybody's at that level. That'd be cool. That would have worked. Right? That would be working. We got a lot more people, a lot more technology, a lot more power, and we're all super wise. Maybe we could work this out. But that's not the case, because the evolution of wisdom maybe has progressed on some incremental microscopic level, maybe a little, and the evolution of the power available for the people with no wisdom, who are basically into power, into greed, into hatred, and into delusion, the technological leveraging of that power has been huge. Orders and orders of magnitude over what it was at the Buddhist time. The Buddhist time, basically, the amount of power that a person could have physically over anything was what they could hold in their hand. That was it. They could throw something, or they could hit you with a stick. Now people can launch nuclear weapons and, change the climate of the planet. So we have all this power with very little wisdom. And that's just the way evolution has happened. That's not anybody's fault. Nobody, chose that. Nobody chose that. And if we had the benefit of looking at the entire universe, and maybe there are no other intelligent civilizations in the entire universe, but that seems somewhat mathematically unlikely. It seems more likely that there are millions of them. And maybe we could do a statistical survey and see, humanity, okay, we're sort of in the middle. We may make it, we may not. And there were some that were much wiser and, had maybe less power craziness. And then there were some that were too wimpy and spiritual, and they didn't make it either because they were too wimpy and spiritual. It takes a combination, right? I mean, we wouldn't have made it through evolution if we didn't have some kind of this greed, this aggression, this delusion. We wouldn't have made it. The Pleistocene megafauna would have wiped us out during the ice ages. There were plenty of big animals chasing humans around trying to eat us, and if we hadn't gotten our shit together, we wouldn't have made it. So we had to be somewhat aggressive, somewhat crazy, somewhat tribal to make it. So this isn't anybody's fault. This just is what it is. Is it fair? No, of course it's not fair. But it's not unfair either. It just is. Is it a good situation for us right now as humans on this planet? No, it's a shit situation. We may not make it. And we may take a whole lot of other really cool animals with us that didn't do anything to deserve any of this. But it is what it is. That's just the way it is. This is you have to see that it's not like whoever's fault. You could say, okay, Trump, and then if it wasn't him, but all he is doing is manifesting this aspect of all of our natures. We all have the inner Trump. If you haven't found your inner Trump yet...
Did you just coin that?
I'm thinking about my Buddha nature.
What's that?
I'd rather think about our Buddha nature.
Yeah, well, of course. But we all have the inner Trump. We all have it all in us. And it's just a matter of what's fed and what's cultivated and what's manifested. But if you haven't found your inner Trump yet, then, maybe you're not looking hard enough.
So what happens if we actually find our inner Trump? What do we do with it?
Don't vote for it. Don't vote for it. Don't identify with it. Don't feed it. But love it to death. Love it to death. Don't pretend it's not there. Don't deny it. Don't repress it. Don't avoid it. Love it to death. Don't manifest it. So this first step is that we really are faced with, different levels of dukkha in ourselves and outside of ourselves. And then we have to be willing to be with how that feels. Be willing to be with how that feels. And using our practice to do that. This is what's called being a spiritual warrior. It's using our practice to be with what we would rather not be with. Because it is. That's what's inside of us. That's the world that we're creating. Now, when we start doing that, then all of the energy that is involved in repressing or avoiding or pushing away, aversive to these feelings and to these situations, starts to stop fighting. And it becomes available. So we're putting out a lot of energy that we're not even aware of on an unconscious or subconscious level to fight off the world that we're creating in our minds, but it's still the world, and it hurts. And, we can feel it hurting us. And we're putting out this energy to what do I do? What should I do? Or I can't deal with it, or it's too much, or whatever that is. When that energy becomes available, because we're not putting it out here, it's not like a force field that we're trying to keep up the shields, like in Star Trek, Mr. Sulu, put up the shields. That's a lot of energy, right? When the shields were up, the Enterprise had less energy for other stuff. So that energy becomes available. Star Trek it's never dated. That energy becomes available for something else. And that something else is the capacity for compassionate, wise, generous action, rather than action that's about, I don't want to feel this. I don't want to have to live in a world that has this. I don't want to have to deal with this. That's one kind of action. Another kind of action is, I'm okay. I'm actually okay. And I have this energy, and the world needs it. The world needs it from me. And it can manifest from a place of compassion, from a place of generosity, from a place of wisdom. The world isn't going to be helped by us being unhappy or tangled into knots or identified. The world has plenty of that. Whatever the world is, it has plenty of that. What it needs is healing. But we can't heal, we can't bring healing energy that's basically unhealthy. We can't heal with unhealthy energy. We can't heal with energy that's basically about, I don't want to feel this. I don't want to deal with this. It's like, oh, I'll help you out here because you're gross. You know, that's not, I mean, is that how you want your doctor to check you out? You know, like, you're so unhealthy, and I don't even want to touch you. I don't even want to be in the room with you. Let's get a robot with box gloves and we'll take care of you. No. This is like what's our capacity to be here fully in this and be okay with it. And then we've got healing energy that can actually do something. That's what spirituality wants to do. Spirituality naturally wants to heal. It naturally wants to make whole. It naturally does that. It's a natural flow of energy. It doesn't take an effort. There's no need to protect. It's okay. You know, you look at Mother Teresa. Like, you know, that's that kind of energy. It's not getting bummed out. It's just manifesting generosity or compassion. And remember, compassion feels the pain. Compassion isn't separate. Part of compassion is that you're actually feeling the pain of whatever it is that you are being compassionate towards, whether it's your own pain and compassion to yourself, or somebody else's pain, compassion for them. Compassionate means with feeling. So you can't do this without feeling pain. But you don't need to be identified with it. It's just a sense of connection. And then the other side of it of compassion is the desire or the wish to make it better. And in some cases, that wish to make things better, to alleviate pain or suffering or to help, is basically just that. It's a wish. There's nothing that we can do. Most of the time, nothing we can do. And then some of the time there is. Most of the time, all we can do is feel compassion. We can feel that wish, but you know, there's suffering everywhere. We can only be in one place at a time. There's vast amounts of suffering, and if we take it all on, we simply get overwhelmed or disillusioned. But if we can find the places where, oh, wow, right here, right in front of me, here's a situation, here's a person, and I can just be here with them, and maybe that's helpful. Or maybe I can do something. Make something, give something, plant something, write something, hold something, whatever. That's real. But the overwhelm, what we're being overwhelmed by, is the world that we constructed in our mind. Because how much is actually right in front of us? at any given moment. What's in front of us in any given moment we can deal with, but the world that we're creating in our mind, amplified by media and amplified by concepts, is completely overwhelming. There's no way that we can deal with that world. So I want to look at this. See. Oh yeah, that's another piece. There is another piece too. Besides this world that we create and the sense of self that we create, if either through insight and deconstruction or connecting into being, we start to see or can start to see what's underneath or surrounding or holding all of that. You could call that true nature, Buddha nature, emptiness, love. It's the field of love that I talked about, that the email person was sort of like, well, where's that at? You know, that's, you could call it the ground of being. I don't know, whatever concept, you could call it God. You could call it whatever you want, whatever concept or wording works for you. But at some point in spiritual development, there becomes an awareness, maybe a little bit, maybe subtle, maybe a lot at once, which is a blessing and it's also scary, that, oh wow, the self and world that I thought were reality are like a little piece of stuff floating in this vast ocean of being, or presence, or God, or emptiness, or whatever you want to call it. And that's something to cultivate. That's something to notice when you have glimpses of it, or more than glimpses of it, and cultivate it through practice. You could call that the absolute. So we have the relative world and the absolute world. In the relative world, it's a clusterfuck. I mean, it literally is, right? And we're sitting here looking at a planet that, may get completely off kilter in terms of climate and ecology and environment, and which will cause societal collapse and possibly huge wars and dislocation of vast numbers of people, vast numbers of species going extinct, etc., etc. I mean, that's the relative world. That's like really bad. And on the other hand, in the absolute world, the world of being, the world of what is, it's just what is. It's actually all okay. It's actually all perfect. And they're both true. It doesn't mean that one overrules the other. It doesn't mean one is more real. In the Heart Sutra, it's form is emptiness, emptiness is form. They're each the other. The delusion is either being trapped in the world of form in the relative world, or being trapped in the world of emptiness in the absolute world, and thinking that's the real one, and the other one is fake, or the other one's wrong. The delusion isn't in both. And actually seeing both or experiencing both as one, as the same. So yes, it's a mess and it's just right. Which is a lot preferable to it's just a mess. But saying it's just perfect and that's the end of the story is also, in some way, it's like disrespectful to all the everything that's going on the ground here on planet Earth. You're just sort of like saying, well, you know, all of you people and animals and beings and ecosystems and all of that are irrelevant because I'm in this like super attenuated spiritual space and I'm above it all. So it's like, can you be in both? So you know, like take the Dalai Lama as an oft-used example. He's obviously tuned into the absolute world. He's a pretty happy guy. Seems to be giggly and smiling and sweet to everybody, but he is not unaware of the suffering of the Tibetan people and what the Chinese have done to his country, his culture, his religion, his landscape, his society. I mean, that's dukkha. I mean, that's the whole shit show foisted on one group of people that basically were trying to mind their own business. And then, you know, the Chinese have just been on them and on them and on them for a really long time. And it's gotten horrendous. It's genocide, culture-cide. And he holds that too. It's not like he's unaware of it. It's not like he's not trying to do something about it. Unfortunately, he's been relatively ineffective, but that's not his fault. It's just, there's trillions more energy on the Chinese side than on the Tibetan side, in terms of numbers, weapons, dollars, etc. He's pretty outnumbered. So he's living in both those worlds with this situation. He's not depressed or suicidal or giving up or selling out or angry, bitter, disillusioned. At least that I can tell. But he's got no illusions about how bad it is either. So that's what we're talking about here. Can we face the intensity of the emotions that we feel without getting overwhelmed or depressed or in some way negatively impacted in our own equilibrium, our own capacity for equanimity, which is why equanimity is so important to developing compassion. Compassion is actually difficult. It hurts. And so a certain degree of equanimity is important that we can hold and allow things to just, okay, this is the way it is. Can I just let it be the way it is? It's not the way I want it to be, but it is the way it is. So can I just be with that? That's strengthening our capacity for being, as opposed to doing. We're so used to, doing. We have to learn how to do this, do that, figure this out, make this happen, change that, fix it. But what about just being? Just being with things as they are. That's equanimity. But it's a doorway into this allowing things to be exactly as they are and seeing the perfection in that. Which then can undergird with strength and wisdom and generosity our willingness to go and make them better, to be part of healing the world. You know, the Bodhisattva vow. Beings are limitless. I vow to save them all. Well, that's not really going to happen. But it's an intention. It's a wish. It's the same wish in the metta phrases. May all beings be happy. That's not even possible. When the fox gets the rabbit, guess who's happy? Guess who's not happy? You know, how can all beings be happy? When the fox gets the rabbit, the fox is happy and the rabbit's not. That's just life the way it is. But that doesn't mean that we can't wish the fox well, and it doesn't mean we can't wish the rabbit well. What's in our heart isn't about science. It's not about biology. It's not about taking sides. It's just about wishing the open heart, wishing that all beings are happy. Not just successful predators. You know, may the rabbit be happy, may the fox be happy. At some point, both are going to die. There's a certain amount of media news talking about the situation or situations, the world, with people focusing on and thinking about it. That's relevant or necessary or important just to be part of a society, part of a culture. Unless you're going to be a monk or a nun and sort of drop out and get into a complete spiritual container and not let your consciousness know what's going on for some period of time, living in the world, we're kind of like, okay, we're here, we're part of the game, we need to know a certain amount about what's going on just to be fully here. And also to allow this process, this alchemy process that needs to happen, to get the input to trigger the kind of emotions that generated this email, which any of us could have written, myself included. So this is like fuel for this kind of work, this difficult work of being in the world and learning how to be happy, I guess. Happy within the situation that we're living in. So there's a certain amount of that that's necessary. And then there's a certain amount that's toxic. Like if it's more than what you need to do all that, and then we're kind of like, we become addicted to this stimulation that is actually causing us pain, anxiety, fear, depression, a sense of hopelessness. That is really destructive. There's too much. You're listening to the radio and then you're reading the internet and then you're watching TV and it's all in the news and it's all like keeping informed and then you're reading articles and books and it's like this tidal wave of information, which is only a trillionth of what's going on in the world anyway, right? It's infinite what's going on. I mean, there's an infinite number of news feeds and perspectives and facts and opinions and geographies and whatnot. And we can get quickly overwhelmed by it. And it becomes toxic, destructive, overwhelming, and there's no way to dig out of that. And we have to control ourselves because this stuff is addictive. It's like sugar, except it doesn't taste good. But maybe sugar's the wrong analogy. Yeah. It's like a negative addiction. Like if I get wound up around some issue or some topic, and then I'm checking the NewYorkTimes.com more than once a day, it's like I can feel that compulsion. Like, what do you do now? It's like. So it's one thing to say that we have to do this work and we have to be open and feel it and process it and be with it. And it's another thing to, trying to drink out of a fire hose. Like you've got to crank down the fire hose into, a little drinking fountain that you sip from a few times a day to get your appropriate amount of information and media and whatnot. And it's got to be way less than what they're trying to sell us. Way less than what they're trying to sell us. Because it's infinite. What's available to us is infinite. So we each have to make sure that we're doing that we're not taking in more than we can process and deal with. It's healthy. Certain amount of toxic stuff actually makes us stronger. But too much kills us, kills the spirit. And we each have to sort of figure that out for ourselves. Because this email could come from a place of, it just happened that everything cohered at that moment and there was a lot and it triggered something, and that triggering is a really meaningful and valid and important question of inquiry that we all need to do. But that email could also come from a place where you're spending 3 hours a day reading and listening and watching the news, and that's way too much. And that's going to become like, it's like, how do I deal with the fact that my house is at the beach and every high tide it floods? Well, your house shouldn't be at the beach where it floods at high tide. You got to move your house. You can't deal with that. It's too much. Like, move your frickin' house. or leave the house. Move out of that house. Get out of that house. It's too close to the water. It's too much. If there's guilt or shame, then that's a whole different story. That sense of guilt or shame is something that we need to deal with in our own inner work, in our own emotional work. Like, well, what's that from? Where was the trigger for that? The world itself, isn't getting any benefit out of us feeling guilty or ashamed for anything. So we live relatively privileged, safe, healthy lives here in Boulder, Colorado, in our little bubble. This isn't like the worst place in the world to be. It's like the best, or easily one of the best. One of the safest, one of the cleanest, one of the friendliest, one blah, blah, blah. So it's easy to look out at, the situations that other people are in and to feel compassion, to feel the pain of what we have that they don't have is one thing. But if we're feeling guilty or ashamed, that's one, it's not doing anybody any good. It's just making us less than. It's debilitating us. And it's not coming from out here. Nature isn't trying to make us feel guilty or ashamed. Nature may want us to get off our butts and do something useful from a place of generosity or compassion or wisdom. Yes, I would guess nature would like that. But nature isn't trying to guilt us or shame us into doing that. Nature would like us to wake up into doing that. So if we're feeling any degree of guilt or shame, that's our own projection. That's our own stuff. That's our avoidance of feeling what's happening. It's some way of debilitating ourselves to match the debilitation of what we're seeing or feeling around us, which is not useful. It's not real. So if that's happening for you, it has nothing to do with the world. It's your own personal, emotional tangle that you need to untangle. May come from, it's not coming from an objective situation. It's probably coming from some kind of bad conditioning from parents or peers or growing up, some kind of theology that tells you that you shouldn't or you aren't or whatever. So that's not the motivation here. That's not what we're after. Guilt, shame, that's not compassion, that's not wisdom, that's not generosity, that's not spirituality. That's something that we need to heal in ourselves. And it's a very important distinction. Because there's lots of theology out there that tries to guilt and shame us into doing stuff. Or guilt and shame us about who we are or what we are. And that's not what this is. If there's presence and love, then there's a certain degree of joy. There's a certain degree of love. There's a certain degree of peace and okayness. That's completely healthy, even in the face of the most dire circumstances. There can be that. And it's nothing to be ashamed of.